In Brightwater, Montana, winter made every roof shine and every forgotten person harder to see. Graham Mercer had only a small paycheck, an old cabin, and a loyal German shepherd named Atlas. But every payday he still carried food, blankets, and dog treats through the snow. One evening, Atlas stopped near the old train station and heard something Graham almost missed. Under a homeless man's only coat, 3 abandoned puppies were fighting to stay alive. What began as one quiet rescue would become a room, a light, and a town, learning how to care again. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Brightwater, Montana, looked almost innocent under snow. The lake lay frozen beyond the town, wide and pale beneath a morning sky polished clean by cold. Along Main Street, rooftops carried thick white caps, porch rails glittered with frost, and strings of yellow lights hung in shop windows like small promises that the world had not entirely forgotten warmth. Chimneys breathed slow gray smoke. A snowplow groaned past the pharmacy, pushing aside a ridge of powder that caught the light and shone for a moment like ground glass. It was the kind of winter scene that belonged on postcards and bakery tins. It was also the kind that hid things well. A man sleeping in the cab of a dead truck behind the feed store. A woman folding newspapers inside her coat under the overhang of the closed laundromat. A pair of boots sticking out from beneath the loading dock of the old hardware warehouse where someone had chosen shadow over wind. Brightwater liked to call itself a good town, and most days maybe it was. But goodness, Graham Mercer had learned, often depended on where a person was willing to look. Graham lived at the edge of that looking. His cabin stood beyond the last row of houses, where the pines thickened and the road narrowed into a white track between dark trees. It was a small place with a sagging porch, a tin roof, and smoke stains above the stovepipe. Nothing about it asked for admiration. It kept out most of the weather, held the smell of coffee and pine wood, and gave his German shepherd a patch of rug beside the stove. That was enough. Graham Mercer was 51, tall and broad-shouldered, built less like a man from a gym than a man shaped by weather, labor, and old discipline. His face was square but slightly long, his nose straight except for the old bend where it had once been broken. Cold had reddened his skin over the years, and lines cut deep around his eyes, not from smiling often, but from watching carefully. His hair, dark brown with silver worked through it, was cut short without being neat. A rough beard shadowed his jaw most mornings, whether he meant it to or not. He wore the same kind of shirt whenever work allowed it. An olive-drab combat shirt fitted close through the body, the sleeves patterned in faded camouflage with dark horizontal bands at the biceps. Over it, depending on the weather, came a brown canvas jacket scarred by old nails, sawdust, and salt from the roads. His boots were heavy, practical, and never fully clean. People in Brightwater knew Graham, though not many could say they knew him well. They knew he shoveled the pharmacy steps before sunrise if Mrs. Calloway's knees were acting up. They knew he repaired loose porch boards for widows and never charged enough. They knew Nolan Creed, who owned the lumber and supply store, cursed his name at least twice a week and still kept hiring him, which in Brightwater counted as friendship. What people did not know was how carefully Graham folded his pay. Every other Friday he sat at his kitchen table after work, steam rising from a chipped mug, Atlas lying at his feet. He placed his cash in small stacks. Rent and power first, groceries second, dog food for Atlas third. Then came the smallest stack, the one he slid into a worn envelope with no writing on it. He called it, in the privacy of his own dry humor, the Cold Fund. Atlas knew that envelope. The German shepherd lifted his head every time Graham touched it, ears forward, amber eyes following the man's hands. Atlas was 6 years old, black and tan with a dark saddle across his back and a thick mane of fur around his neck that made him look almost regal in winter. One ear stood clean and sharp, The other had a small notch along the edge, a souvenir from a life before soft rugs and stove heat. His brown leather collar bore a scratched metal tag with his name. Graham tapped the envelope once against the table. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "You still eat better than I do." Atlas thumped his tail once, unconvinced. It was an old argument between them, and like most old arguments between loyal souls, neither side expected to win. The cold fund never held much. Some weeks it bought only 2 cans of soup, a pair of wool socks, batteries for a flashlight, and a small bag of cheap dog food. Other weeks, when work had been steady and no pipe burst at the cabin, it stretched a little farther. But Graham had learned long ago that help did not always need to arrive grandly. Sometimes it came as dry socks, sometimes as a can opener, sometimes as a paper cup of coffee placed beside someone who had forgotten the feeling of being offered anything without suspicion. And not all of it came from him. Over the years, without ever calling it charity, Graham had built a quiet chain across town. The bakery left day-old bread in a brown sack near the back door. The grocery store set aside dented cans and food close to expiration. Ruth Harlan at the laundromat saved unclaimed blankets, washed them twice, folded them with white ribbon, and pretended it was no trouble. Dr. Marion Vale at the veterinary clinic sometimes handed Graham sample bags of dog food with a warning not to tell anyone she had a heart. Graham never told. He only carried. That Friday afternoon, the storm warning came while he was unloading salt bags behind Nolan's store. The radio near the register crackled with talk of pressure dropping fast, lake-effect snow building by evening, wind gusts strong enough to close county roads. Nolan, round-faced and red-cheeked beneath a gray knit cap, leaned on the counter with a pencil tucked behind his ear and gave the sky an offended look, as though weather were a supplier who had missed a deadline. "Blizzard before supper," Nolan said. "You hear that, Mercer? Even the clouds are trying to put me out of business." Graham hefted the last salt bag into place. "You'd charge them storage fees." "Damn right I would." The joke landed between them like a small, warm coal. Graham almost smiled. Nolan saw it and looked pleased, though he covered it by pretending to check an invoice. "You heading out with your little saint sack today?" Nolan asked. "It's not a saint sack." "What is it then?" "Groceries." "For men who don't pay you back." Graham pulled on his gloves. "Most people don't." Nolan snorted, but when Graham turned toward the door, a cardboard box was waiting beside it. Cans of stew, 2 packs of hand warmers, and a bundle of mismatched work gloves lay inside. "Inventory mistake," Nolan muttered. "Don't make a sermon out of it." Graham looked at the box, then at him. "No sermon?" "Good. I hate sermons." "So do I." Atlas waited outside the store, sitting in the falling snow with the patience of an old guard. A few flakes had gathered on his muzzle. When Graham stepped out carrying the box and his own canvas bag, Atlas rose immediately and pressed his shoulder against Graham's leg. The town had brightened under the snow. Not darkened, brightened. Winter in Brightwater had a strange mercy in the first hour of snowfall. It softened the alleys, covered the rust, laid a clean white hand over every dented truck and cracked sidewalk. For a little while, everything looked forgiven. Graham knew better. He made his usual rounds. Behind the pharmacy, he left soup and socks with a man named Earl, who always pretended he had just been resting his eyes. Near the laundromat, Ruth came out with 2 blankets bundled in her arms, her silver curls tucked beneath a scarf. "You tell Jasper I put the brown one in there," she said, nodding toward Graham's bag. "He likes brown, says gray makes him look too much like a pigeon." Graham adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "He say that?" "He said it with his eyebrows." "That sounds like Jasper." Ruth's warm face dimmed a little as she looked toward the north end of town. "You checked the station yet?" "Heading there now." "Good." She hesitated, then tucked a small tin into the side pocket of his bag. "Tea biscuits. For him, not you." "I'm wounded." "You'll survive. He has fewer teeth than you." Atlas gave a soft huff, and Ruth bent to scratch behind his notched ear. "And none for you, General. Last time you drooled on my clean sheets." Atlas leaned into her hand with shameless dignity. The old train station stood beyond the last stretch of Main Street, where the road curved toward the abandoned mill yard. Once, Brightwater had sent timber, mail, soldiers, brides, coffins, and Christmas parcels through that station. Now its sign hung crooked, the paint peeled in long curls, and the platform roof sagged under snow. The tracks behind it had not carried a train in years. Still, Graham always thought the place looked like it was waiting. Jasper Bell usually waited there too. He would sit on an overturned wooden crate near the boarded ticket window, wearing his old brown-gray coat, hands folded over a paper cup of coffee as if it were a formal invitation. Jasper was 77 and thin as a fence rail, with a soft silver beard and eyes the pale gray of worn river stones. He had once repaired violins, though Graham had learned that only by noticing the way the old man handled anything fragile, with respect first, usefulness second. Jasper never begged. That was part pride, part wound. When Graham brought him food, Jasper accepted it like a man signing a treaty. But that afternoon, the crate was empty. Graham stopped at the edge of the platform. Snow moved across the boards in thin silver lines. Jasper's place held no cup, no folded paper, no old blanket tucked against the wall. Even the scrap of cardboard he used to block the wind was gone. Atlas stepped ahead, nose low. "Jasper?" Graham called. His voice struck the station wall and came back smaller. Wind moved through a broken pane somewhere above them. The sound was high and lonely, almost musical, like a violin string tightened too far. Graham walked the length of the platform, boots creaking over packed snow. He checked behind the freight door, under the overhang, near the rusted bench where Jasper sometimes slept when the wind shifted. Nothing. A familiar irritation rose in him first, because fear often wore irritation as a coat. Old fool probably went wandering. But beneath that thought came another, colder one. The storm was early. The temperature was dropping. County Road 9 would be closed before dark if the wind kept rising. Jasper's knees had been bad all week. His cough had sounded worse the last time Graham saw him. Atlas froze near the broken fence at the far end of the station, not alert like danger. Not yet. It was something more precise. His head lifted, his nostrils widened, the notched ear twitched toward the mill yard, then forward again. He took 2 steps, stopped, and looked back at Graham. "What is it?" Atlas did not bark. That was what tightened Graham's chest. The dog lowered his nose to the snow near the fence. Graham crouched beside him and saw the faint marks, footprints half erased by fresh powder, angled away from the station toward the old mill's parking lot. One print dragged slightly, as if the person had stumbled or favored one leg. Beside it, a smaller smear cut across the snow, not a footprint. Fabric, maybe. Something pulled low. Graham removed one glove and touched the edge of the track, fresh enough that the wind had not yet taken it. Then he heard it. Maybe he heard it, a sound so thin it might have been a nail creaking in the cold. A small, broken whimper carried between gusts and gone before he could be sure it had existed. Atlas heard it too. The German shepherd's body changed all at once. His shoulders tightened, tail straightened, ears locked forward. He let out one sharp bark that cracked across the empty station and startled snow from the platform roof. Then he ran. "Atlas!" The dog cut through the gap in the fence, not toward the cabin road, not toward Main Street, but toward the abandoned mill yard, where the light already seemed bluer and the wind had begun to gather teeth. Graham stood for half a second with the canvas bag in one hand and Nolan's box in the other. Behind him lay town, warmth, the sensible route home before the blizzard sealed the roads. Ahead lay the mill yard, empty warehouses, broken pavement hidden under snow, and whatever had made Atlas forget every command except the oldest one in his bones. Find what's hurting. Graham looked back once toward Brightwater. The shop lights glowed soft and golden through the snowfall. A postcard town. A kind town when it remembered to be. Then the wind pushed hard against his back. He dropped Nolan's box beneath the station overhang, tightened his grip on the canvas bag, and followed Atlas through the fence. The snow was falling thicker now, bright as ash in the failing afternoon. Graham pulled his collar up, lowered his head, and moved toward the sound he was no longer sure he had heard. Ahead, Atlas barked again, not warning, calling. And Graham Mercer, who had spent years telling himself that a man could survive by keeping his world small, ran into the widening white. Atlas did not run like a dog chasing something. He ran like a dog answering. Through the broken fence and across the white waste of the old mill yard, the German shepherd moved low, sure-footed, his black and tan body cutting through the falling snow. Graham followed, boots punching into powder that hid cracked asphalt, rusted bolts, and the old scars of a town that had once made its living from timber and iron. The wind pushed at his side, sharp enough to make his eyes water. The abandoned mill crouched ahead in the storm, all sheet metal, broken windows, and beams blackened by years of weather. Beyond it sat the old way station, a smaller structure with a collapsed sign and a roof that sagged like a tired shoulder. In summer, weeds grew through the concrete there. In winter, it looked like the last place on earth a living thing would choose to stop. Atlas reached it first. He did not bark again. He slowed near the half-fallen awning and stood rigid, head lowered, tail straight behind him. His breath smoked in quick bursts. Then he glanced back at Graham once, not impatient, not frightened, commanding in the quiet way only a faithful dog could be. Graham stepped closer. At first, he saw only a heap of brown and gray against the wall, a shape nearly swallowed by snow. Then the shape moved. A thin hand rose, trembling beneath the edge of a threadbare sleeve. Jasper. The old man was sitting on the ground beneath the broken awning, knees drawn up, back bent forward so hard it seemed he was trying to fold himself around something. Snow had settled on his silver beard and in the creases of his hat. His face was pale, not simply with cold, but with the stunned, distant look of someone whose body had started bargaining with the weather and was losing. He was not wearing his coat. That was what Graham noticed first. The brown-gray coat, the one Ruth had said made him look less like a pigeon, was spread across his lap and tucked beneath his arms. Jasper held it closed with both hands, his fingers blue at the knuckles, the fabric shaking with him. Something inside the coat made a sound. Small, wet, alive. Graham dropped to one knee so fast the canvas bag slid from his shoulder. Atlas lowered himself beside the old man and pressed his broad body against the open side of the awning, blocking some of the wind. His notched ear flattened briefly as snow whipped across his muzzle. "Jasper," Graham said again, softer this time, "look at me." The old man's gray eyes lifted. For a moment they did not seem to know where they were. Then recognition came, thin but real. "Graham," he whispered, "I tried to get them out of the wind." Graham's gaze fell to the coat. 3 puppies were tucked inside it. They were so small that for half a second Graham's mind refused the sight. Not because he had never seen small creatures suffer, he had seen plenty, in enough corners of the world to last 10 lifetimes, but because there was something obscene about how little space their lives occupied. 3 handfuls of fur, bone, and breath beneath an old man's only warmth. One puppy had pale tan fur darkened by wet streaks, its little mouth opening and closing in weak protest. Another, blacker through the back, had wedged itself into the fold near Jasper's ribs, shivering so hard the coat trembled around it. The third was smaller than the others, brown gold with its head turned awkwardly to the side. It barely moved. Atlas shifted closer, careful as a priest approaching an altar. He touched his nose to the smallest puppy's flank, then drew back and looked at Graham. Not panic. Need. Graham pulled off one glove with his teeth and slid his bare fingers beneath the puppy's chest. A faint heartbeat fluttered there. Too fast, too fragile, like a moth trapped in a jar. "Still here," he muttered. Jasper closed his eyes, and something like relief passed over his face. "I heard them," the old man said. His voice came in pieces, broken by cold. "Thought it was metal at first, wind in that old sign. Then I heard it again." Graham did not ask him to explain yet. He opened his bag and pulled out the wool socks meant for Earl, Ruth's biscuits wrapped in paper, a pair of hand warmers from Nolan's box, and 2 thin towels he had tucked in without thinking. He always packed more than people asked for. A habit from another life, though he no longer called it preparation. These days he called it being less foolish than yesterday. He cracked the hand warmers and wrapped them in cloth so they would not burn the puppy's skin. Then he began moving the small bodies one by one, slow and deliberate. "Keep the coat around them," he told Jasper. "Don't let the wind take the heat." Jasper tried to nod, but his chin shook too hard. "I saw the car," he said. Graham looked up. "What car?" Jasper swallowed. His lips had a bluish tint now. That worried Graham more than the words. "Dark one. Maybe black, maybe blue. Hard to tell in this weather." He drew a breath that seemed to scrape. "Came down the service road, stopped by the old scale. Someone opened the door and set a box down." "Set?" Jasper's eyes tightened. "Dropped," he corrected quietly. "Not set?" Wind filled the space between them. Somewhere behind the way station, a loose panel banged once, then again, like an impatient fist. "I thought it was trash," Jasper said. "Then the box moved." Graham's jaw hardened. No outburst came. Outbursts used heat, and right now, heat belonged to the puppies. How long ago? Few minutes before Atlas came. Maybe 10, maybe less. I don't know. Jasper looked down at the coat. "They rolled out when the sides split. I couldn't carry all 3. I thought if I got them under the awning—" His voice failed. "I thought I could wait for the wind to ease." Graham saw then what Jasper had done, the tracks in the snow, the drag mark. The old man had not simply found the puppies and sat down. He had crawled part of the way, gathering them against his body, using his coat as a nest. He had turned himself into the wall the building no longer was. A strange anger rose in Graham, cold and clean, not the loud kind, the useful kind. He wrapped the smallest puppy inside one towel, then opened his canvas jacket and tucked the bundle against his own chest, beneath the olive-drab combat shirt's outer layer. The puppy's cold body touched him through the fabric, shocking as ice water. He held it there anyway. The tan puppy went into the crook of his left arm. The darker one he wrapped and placed back into Jasper's coat for the old man to hold, because he suspected Jasper needed to hold at least one, or he might break from the shame of being rescued. "We're going," Graham said. Jasper tried to push himself up and failed. His legs slid in the snow. "Graham, I can't." "You can. I'll slow you." "You already did the hard part." The old man gave a weak, bitter laugh. "Sitting in the snow? Choosing not to walk away." That silenced him. For a moment Jasper looked at Graham not as a man being helped, but as a man who had been understood. It was brief, a match struck in wind, but it burned long enough. Atlas stepped to Jasper's side. He nosed under the old man's elbow and braced himself, allowing Jasper to lean a little weight against his shoulder. Graham took the other side, his free hand gripping Jasper beneath the arm. The old man was lighter than Graham expected. Too light. A bundle of bones, wet wool, and stubbornness. They moved slowly. The mill yard had seemed wide when Graham crossed it alone. Going back, it became a country. Each step demanded negotiation. The wind shoved at Jasper's back. The snow hid the dips in the pavement. Twice the old man's knees buckled. Twice Atlas stopped before Graham even spoke, planting his paws until Jasper found balance again. The puppy against Graham's chest twitched once. He looked down, breath held. Again, a small movement, no larger than a shiver. "Good," he whispered, unsure whether he spoke to the puppy, to himself, or to whatever mercy had not abandoned the mill yard completely. Jasper heard him. "Is that the little one?" Still fighting. The old man's face crumpled in a way Graham almost wished he had not seen. Not because it was ugly, because it was too human. Jasper looked suddenly less like a drifting figure from the north end of town, and more like a man who had once had a table, a lamp, a wife, a place where his hands knew what to do. "I couldn't leave them," Jasper said. "I know." "They were just babies." "I know." "No one would have known." Graham tightened his grip under the old man's arm. "You would have." Snow blew across the service road in pale sheets. The old train station came into view at last, dim through the storm. Graham had left Nolan's box under the overhang. It was already dusted white. For one practical second, he considered stopping to retrieve it. Then the puppy against his chest made a sound like a broken reed. He kept walking. By the time they reached the cabin road, Graham's shoulders ached from holding both puppies and supporting Jasper. His own coat was on the old man. Cold had worked its way through the combat shirt and into the sweat along his spine. Atlas's fur was rimmed with frost. The cabin appeared between the pines, squat and stubborn, a weak yellow light burning above the porch where Graham had forgotten to turn it off that morning. It looked smaller than usual, too small for what he was bringing into it. Too small, maybe, for what he had just promised without saying so. Inside, warmth struck them like a mercy and a warning. Warmth could save. Warmth could also shock cold bodies if a man was careless. Graham knew enough not to be careless. He guided Jasper to the chair nearest the stove, but not against it. "Sit. Keep that puppy wrapped." Jasper sank down, shuddering violently now that he was out of the wind. That was often how it happened. A body held itself together until shelter arrived, then admitted the cost. Atlas did not go to his rug. He circled once near Jasper's chair, then laid down with his side against the old man's boots. Graham moved quickly. He placed the tan puppy in a shallow box lined with towels near the stove, far enough from the direct heat. The smallest he kept against his chest while he warmed another towel. He checked mouths, paws, breathing. He put water in a pan to warm, not boil. He grabbed the emergency thermometer from the medicine drawer and cursed when his hands shook enough to fumble it. Not fear, he told himself. Urgency. But the body did not always care what name a man gave it. He took out his phone and called Marion Vale first. She answered on the fourth ring with wind roaring behind her. "If this is about your truck making that grinding noise I told you last month." "Puppies," Graham said. 3, dumped in the snow. Cold exposure. 1 week. There was no pause after that. Marion's voice changed, all sharp edges becoming tools. "How old?" "Maybe 8 weeks, maybe less." "Wet?" "Yes." "Do not put them against direct heat. Wrap them dry, warm slowly. If you have honey or corn syrup, rub a little on the gums only if they're conscious enough not to choke. I'm coming." "Roads are getting bad." "Then I'll insult the roads personally when I get there." She hung up. Graham almost smiled. Almost. Next he called Eli Boone. The deputy answered with the flat calm of a man who had been expecting trouble somewhere, if not specifically from Graham. "Boone." Eli, it's Mercer. I found Jasper Bell near the old mill way station. Cold exposure. He found 3 puppies dumped from a vehicle. I need it logged. Jasper conscious? Yes, shivering hard. Pale? Keep him warm, dry if you can. No alcohol, no sudden heat. I'll contact volunteer rescue and head your way. Description of the vehicle? Jasper saw a dark car, maybe black or blue, service road by the mill. Box left near the scale. Eli exhaled through his nose. Of course some coward picked a blizzard. Graham looked toward Jasper. The old man sat hunched in the chair, still holding the dark puppy inside his coat. Atlas had placed one large paw over Jasper's boot. "Come fast," Graham said. "I will." The cabin became a small, busy world. Graham found an old flannel shirt and helped Jasper out of his wet sweater with as much dignity as the situation allowed. The old man kept apologizing each time his fingers failed a button. "Stop," Graham said at last, not harshly but firmly. Jasper blinked. "If you apologize again, I'm giving Atlas your biscuits." A weak laugh escaped the old man before he could stop it. It shook loose some of the terror in the room. "There are biscuits?" Ruth said they were not for me. Wise woman. She usually is. Graham draped blankets over Jasper's shoulders and placed a mug of warm, not hot tea into his hands. Jasper tried to take it, but his fingers trembled too violently. Graham held it steady without comment while the old man drank. That silence mattered. Pity would have wounded Jasper. Efficiency allowed him to remain a man. A knock hit the door hard enough to startle the tan puppy. Marion Vale entered with a gust of snow and the smell of cold leather. She was compact, brisk, and already irritated at the universe. Her chestnut hair was tied low at the back of her neck, half escaped from under a knit cap. A dark veterinary bag hung from one shoulder, patched with faded paw print stickers. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her eyes dark and fiercely awake. She took in the room in one sweep. Jasper in the chair, Atlas beside him, 3 puppies near the stove, Graham in a damp combat shirt with a towel tucked against his chest. "Well," she said, setting down her bag, "you do know how to host a disaster." "Good to see you, too." "I'll decide that after nobody dies." Her hands, when they touched the puppies, were nothing like her voice. They were gentle, exact, almost reverent. She checked gums, temperature, breathing, hydration. She wrapped the smallest puppy in a warm towel and listened with a tiny stethoscope, her brow tightening. "This one's the worst," she said. "But not gone." Jasper's eyes closed. "Thank God." "Thank Graham's dog first," Marion said, "and your coat second." The old man looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd lifted his head as if embarrassed by praise, then rested his chin back near Jasper's boot. Another knock came 15 minutes later. Eli Boone stepped inside, carrying the storm on his shoulders. He was not a large man, but winter seemed to treat him with respect. Snow clung to his sheriff's jacket and the brim of his black knit cap. His face was weathered red-brown, his eyes steady beneath gray brows. In one gloved hand he held a yellow waterproof notebook. He nodded to Graham, then to Jasper, then removed his cap. "Mr. Bell," he said. Not Jasper, not old-timer. "Mr. Bell. I'm going to ask a few questions when you're ready. No rush." That small courtesy changed something in Jasper's posture. He sat a little straighter beneath the blankets. "I can answer." Eli pulled a chair close, but not too close. "Then we'll take it slow." As Marion worked over the puppies, Eli wrote down the account. Dark vehicle, service road, broken carton, time uncertain but recent, wind direction, tracks likely buried by now. He did not pretend they would catch the person by morning. He did not offer heroic promises. He made the truth official, line by line, so it would not vanish under snow. Graham stood near the stove, watching all of it with a weariness that had little to do with the cold. His cabin was too small. His paycheck was too small. His stack of firewood was too small. But Jasper's hands had been large enough to cover 3 freezing puppies. Atlas's body had been large enough to break the wind. Marion's sharp voice had been large enough to hold fear at bay. Eli's notebook was large enough to give cruelty a record. Maybe help did not begin as a grand thing. Maybe it began as proof. The smallest puppy stirred inside Marion's towel. Its mouth opened in a tiny silent yawn, and then, with tremendous effort, it made a sound. Not strong, not safe, but present. Jasper covered his face with one shaking hand. Atlas rose, crossed the small space, and did something he rarely did with strangers. He placed his paw gently on Jasper's boot and leaned his shoulder against the old man's leg, steadying him without demanding anything in return. Graham looked at them, the old man, the dog, the 3 small lives breathing unevenly beside the stove, and felt the shape of the night settle around him. This was no longer a stop on his Friday route, no longer a bag of groceries left beside a crate, no longer a quiet act that could be completed before supper and folded away like the empty envelope on his kitchen table. Outside, the blizzard thickened over Brightwater, covering roads, roofs, tracks, and sins beneath the same bright snow. Inside, Graham Mercer understood with a heaviness that felt almost sacred. Some rescues did not end when the door closed behind you. Some began there. By morning, Brightwater had disappeared beneath a hard white glare. The storm had not passed so much as settled in. Snow filled the low places, climbed the porch steps, buried the edges of roads until the town looked less built than carved out of winter. The lake beyond the pines had vanished into a pale blur. Even sound seemed to move differently. Trucks passed rarely, their engines muffled. Somewhere in the distance, a snowplow scraped at the street with the weary rhythm of a giant sharpening a knife. Graham woke before dawn without remembering when he had slept. He was sitting in the chair by the stove, boots still on, one hand resting on his knee and the other curled near the mug of coffee he had never finished. His back ached. His shirt had dried stiff from melted snow. The brown canvas jacket he had given Jasper hung over a chair, still damp at the hem. The cabin smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, old coffee, and the faint milky scent of puppies. Near the stove, 3 small shapes slept in a towel-lined crate. Biscuit had earned his name sometime around 3 in the morning, when he had managed, despite weakness and exhaustion, to complain loudly enough for Marion to mutter that any creature with that much opinion deserved a breakfast food name. He was pale tan with a white mark beneath his chin, round-bellied even in hunger, and already offended by the world's incompetence. Lantern was darker across the back, smaller, quieter, always turning his head toward light. If the stove shifted, he shifted. If Graham passed with a flashlight, Lantern's little nose followed it, like hope had a beam. The third one was Maple. Graham had not named her quickly. The smallest puppy lay wrapped in a separate towel, close to the others, but not crushed beneath them. She was brown gold, her ears soft and folded, her breathing still too shallow for comfort. A faint pale mark rested on her chest, shaped almost like a leaf if a man was tired enough to believe in signs. Jasper had noticed it first and whispered, "Maple," as if saying the name too loudly might ask too much of her. The name stayed. Atlas lay beside the crate, his thick body curved around it in a crescent of fur and warmth. His amber eyes opened when Graham shifted, but he did not rise. One of the puppies had crawled close enough to press its nose into the long fur at his side. Atlas had accepted the insult to his dignity with the gravity of a king tolerating a sparrow. On the couch, Jasper slept beneath 2 blankets. Sleep did not soften him completely. Even resting, the old man's hands stayed curled near his chest, as if some part of him still expected to wake in the snow and find warmth had only been a rumor. His gray beard had dried in wisps. His boots sat by the stove, stuffed with newspaper. Ruth's brown blanket covered his shoulders, the one she had said he liked because it did not make him look like a pigeon. Graham stood carefully and fed another split log into the stove. The fire caught with a soft crackle. Atlas watched him, then rested his chin again. "Don't start," Graham murmured. The dog's eyes said he had not started anything. Humans, in Atlas's experience, started most of the trouble and then blamed weather. Graham checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Nolan. 1 message. Roads bad? Roof job canceled. Hardware delivery delayed. If you died doing something noble, I'm docking your pay. Graham read it twice, then set the phone down. 2 jobs gone? Maybe 3 if the wind kept up. That meant less money by Friday, and the cabin's power bill was already waiting on the counter beneath a magnet shaped like a trout. The stack of firewood on the porch was not enough if the storm lasted through another night. Dog food for Atlas sat in a half-full bin. Puppy formula, if Marion decided they needed it, would not appear out of snow. He rubbed a hand over his face. He had known numbers before. Coordinates, ranges, fuel limits, extraction windows. Numbers that could get men killed if ignored. These numbers were smaller and somehow more humiliating. Dollars, kilowatts, pounds of kibble, cans of soup, the arithmetic of being decent while broke. From the couch came a dry voice. If that sigh gets any heavier, it'll need its own chair. Graham looked over. Jasper's eyes were open. "Morning," Graham said. "Is it?" "Technically?" Jasper slowly turned his head toward the crate. "They make it?" Graham walked over, crouched, and checked the puppies without moving them too much. Biscuit squeaked with righteous annoyance. Lantern twitched. Maple's chest rose, paused, then rose again. "So far," Graham said. Jasper closed his eyes. The relief that crossed his face was not dramatic. It was small, worn, and deep, like a man finding one unbroken cup in the ruins of a house. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." A practical man might have stopped there. Graham had been trying to become a practical man for years. He still failed at the worst times. "You need to eat," he said. Jasper's mouth tightened. "I can go soon." Graham looked at him. The old man tried to sit up and winced. "I mean it. Road's clear some. I'll head back to the station. You've done enough." "Roads aren't clearing." "I can't stay here." "You can today." "That's not the same as should." Graham had no answer that would not sound like an order, and he was tired enough to know orders could be a kind of cowardice. He went to the kitchen instead and opened a can of soup. The first call came while the soup warmed. Marion's name flashed on the screen. Graham answered before the second ring. "How's Maple?" she asked, skipping greeting entirely. "Breathing. Weak." The other 2 were louder. Loud is good. Loud means they're offended by being alive, which is generally a positive sign. "She needs anything?" "Likely formula. Maybe subcutaneous fluids if she dips again. I'll try to get back out, but the clinic's got a shepherd with a sliced paw and a goat that picked today to reconsider mortality." "Marion." "I'm coming when I can." Her voice softened just enough to become dangerous. "And Graham?" "What?" "You cannot turn your cabin into a long-term emergency shelter." His jaw tightened. Nobody said long-term. Everyone says that on day 1. He looked toward Jasper, who pretended not to listen with the intense focus of a man listening to every syllable. Marion continued. "You did the right thing last night. You called me. You called Eli. Keep doing that. Let this become a process before it becomes a problem." "I hate processes." "I know. That's why I'm using small words." Despite himself, Graham almost laughed. Then another call came in. Unknown number. Local. "Hold on," he told Marion. "If it's the council, do not growl." I don't growl. You outsource that to Atlas. She hung up before he could object. Graham answered the unknown call. Mr. Mercer? A woman's voice, controlled and clear. This is Odessa Pike from the Brightwater town office. Graham looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass in soft ridges. Morning. I understand you took in Mr. Jasper Bell last night, along with several abandoned animals. 3 puppies. Yes, I'm glad they were not left outside. Truly. A pause followed, and in that pause Graham heard the sound of papers being straightened. However, there are concerns. There it was, the word that wore a tie, even over the phone. Concerns, Graham repeated. Your property is not registered as an emergency shelter, nor as an animal foster location. Under normal circumstances, this might simply require a conversation, but with the storm, liability becomes more complicated. Graham closed his eyes. Jasper stared at the stove. Atlas lifted his head. Odessa's voice did not sharpen, but it did not bend either. We've had issues before with informal winter sheltering. You may remember the storage barn fire 6 years ago. I remember nobody died because 3 people dragged 2 men out through a side door. And one of those men suffered burns because an unapproved space heater was connected to damaged wiring, Odessa replied. I also remember the town being held responsible for failing to intervene sooner. The cabin seemed smaller. Graham pictured a woman he had seen at town meetings but never spoken to long. Odessa Pike was tall in posture, if not in height, always in a gray coat, always with a folder held against her ribs like a shield. People called her cold because she made lists before she made promises. Graham had never cared enough to decide whether they were right. Now he heard something under the controlled voice. Not cruelty. Fear with its hair combed neatly. I'm not running a shelter, he said. Not officially. Not unofficially either. I kept an old man and 3 puppies from freezing. And I am saying that if this continues beyond immediate emergency care, we need to involve proper channels. Proper channels were not under that awning last night. No, Odessa said, and I am grateful you were. But gratitude does not remove risk. That line struck him harder than he expected, because it was true, and he hated true things that stood in the way. Jasper shifted on the couch. Tell her I'll leave, he said quietly. Graham turned away from the phone. No? Odessa heard the exchange, her voice softened by a careful inch. Mr. Mercer, no one is asking him to walk into the storm, but I will need to know your plan by this afternoon. My plan is to keep the fire going. That is not a plan. It was last night. Last night is over. Graham said nothing. Outside, wind shouldered against the cabin wall. Inside, Maple made a small, thin sound from the crate. It was not much of a cry, more of a question. Graham looked down. Atlas had risen and was standing over the crate, not alarmed, only watchful. Jasper's eyes were fixed on the puppies, his mouth pressed into a line of pain so old it looked almost polite. Odessa spoke again. I'll call back at 2. The line went dead. For a few seconds, only the stove had anything to say. Then Jasper began folding the blanket, slowly, carefully, with hands still stiff from cold. Graham watched him. What are you doing? Making less trouble. You're not trouble. Graham. The old man said his name not as argument, but as mercy. That made it worse. I've been around long enough to know when a room changes shape around me, Jasper said. Last night, I was a man who needed help. This morning, I'm a complication. You heard half a phone call. I heard enough of my life inside it. Graham stepped toward him. Sit down. Jasper's eyes flicked up, and the old man went still. The reaction was small, but Graham saw it. He had used the voice, not loud, not angry. The old command voice, the one that expected obedience before explanation. It had saved men once. It had probably frightened them too. Jasper looked away and kept folding. A shameful heat rose in Graham's chest. Atlas moved before Graham could speak. The German shepherd stood from the crate, crossed the room, and placed himself between Jasper and the door. He did not block him like a guard. He stood there like a question. Jasper stopped. His fingers tightened around the blanket. "Atlas," Graham said quietly. The dog did not look back. He looked at Jasper. Then he lowered his head and gently placed one paw on the old man's boot. It was the same gesture from the night before, but it meant something different now. Not rescue, not comfort after cold. This was a plea without humiliation. Stay, because you are wanted. Not because you are trapped. Jasper's face shifted, and for the first time, Graham saw how much effort it took the old man not to weep. Not from sadness alone, from the terrible weight of being treated gently after years of making himself easy to overlook. Graham sat down on the edge of the coffee table, leaving space between them. "I'm sorry," he said. Jasper blinked, startled. Graham did not apologize often, not because he believed himself above it, but because apology felt useless unless followed by repair. "I gave an order," Graham said. "You deserved a question." The old man's hands relaxed a little. Graham continued, "Do you want to stay here until the storm breaks?" Jasper looked toward the window where snow pressed hard against the glass, then to the crate, where the puppies breathed in uneven chorus, then to Atlas, whose paw still rested on his boot. "I don't want to cost you work," Jasper said. "That wasn't the question." "I don't want those pups taken because of me." "That wasn't the question either." Jasper gave him a tired look. "You're difficult." "I've been told by professionals." A faint smile touched Jasper's mouth. Then it faded. "Yes," the old man said. "I want to stay until I can stand without pretending." Graham nodded once. "Then we build a better plan." The second half of the morning became less dramatic and more difficult. Drama had wind and barking and men carrying small lives through snow. Difficulty had phone calls, favors, voicemail, bad reception, and the dull embarrassment of asking. Graham called Marion back first. "I need options," he said. "Good." That sounded almost adult. "Don't enjoy it." "I absolutely will." Marion told him what paperwork would be needed for temporary animal care, what supplies the puppies required, and which rules could bend during weather emergencies if someone with a license documented the animal's condition. "And Graham?" "Yeah. You need people." "I have people." "No, you have people you quietly let help so you can pretend you're still alone." He hated that she was good at finding bruises no one could see. Next, he called Eli. The deputy listened, asked 3 practical questions, then said, "A private cabin is a bad long-term answer." "I know." "Do you?" "I'm getting there." Eli paused. "Old train station has a main waiting room still standing." Graham looked up. Jasper did too. "Not safe as is," Eli added, "but maybe for emergency warming use if the fire department clears part of it and the council signs off." Odessa will hate that. Odessa hates lawsuits more than ideas. Give her a safer idea. After that came Ruth. She answered over the hum of dryers. "If this is about Jasper, I already packed blankets." "How did you?" "Small town. Also, Earl talks in his sleep and wakes up informed." Graham closed his eyes. "I may need more than blankets." "Good," Ruth said. "Blankets get lonely without purpose." He called the bakery, the grocery, and the pharmacy. He did not ask for money. That would have made people cautious. He asked for specifics: day-old bread, canned food near date, disposable bowls, hand sanitizer, old towels, a folding table, a working electric kettle. People said maybe. People said they would check. People sighed. People surprised him. Then he called Nolan. The line rang 6 times. "What?" Nolan barked. "I need to ask about the old station." "No, I haven't asked." "You said old station. That's already expensive." Graham rubbed his forehead. "Could the main room be made safe for 3 nights?" "No." Graham waited. Nolan swore. "I mean not by magic, maybe by work. Work, as you may recall, is a thing people pay for. I can pay some. You can pay nothing. You missed 2 jobs." Graham said nothing. Nolan sighed so loudly it crackled through the phone. "Damn it, Mercer. That a yes? That is a weather-dependent, liability-hating, deeply irritated maybe? I'll take it. If that roof drops on my head, I'll haunt you. You'd complain too much. Ghosts would evict you." For the first time that day, Graham heard Nolan laugh. Not warmly, but enough. When he hung up, Jasper was watching him from the couch. Atlas had returned to the crate, where Biscuit was attempting to chew the edge of a towel with the commitment of a much larger animal. "You're calling everyone," Jasper said. "Trying to. I thought you didn't like doing that." "I don't." "Why?" Graham looked at the puppies, at Maple, still breathing, at Atlas, allowing Biscuit's tiny teeth to insult his dignity, at the old man wrapped in borrowed blankets, waiting to be told whether he belonged anywhere for the next 24 hours. "Because my cabin's too small," Graham said. Jasper nodded as if that answer had more rooms inside it than Graham intended. By early afternoon, Graham had a page of notes on the back of an unpaid power bill. Names, supplies, risks, questions. The old train station circled twice. It did not look like hope. It looked like a mess written in pencil. But it was more than he had possessed that morning. At 2 o'clock, Odessa Pike called back. Graham answered standing by the window. Snow blurred the pines. Behind him, Jasper held a mug of soup with steadier hands than before. Atlas lay beside the puppies. Maple slept under Marion's careful instructions, small and stubborn. Odessa did not waste words. "Mr. Mercer, do you have a plan?" Graham looked down at the unpaid bill in his hand. For years he had made his world small because small things could be controlled. A cabin, a paycheck, a route through town, a bag of groceries, a dog at his side, small kindness, small grief, small chances to fail. Now the storm had widened everything. "Yes," he said, "not a perfect one." "I didn't ask for perfect." The old station, main waiting room only, temporary emergency warming space for adults with animals. 3 nights. Marion documents the animals. Eli handles intake and safety checks. Nolan looks at structural repairs. Ruth has blankets. I'll coordinate supplies. Silence. Then Odessa said, "The station hasn't been approved for public use in years." "I know." "The roof over the west corridor is unstable." "We won't use the west corridor." "The electrical system is questionable." "Then we don't turn it on until someone clears it." Another pause. "You've thought about this?" "No," Graham said. "Other people did. I wrote it down." That truth felt strange in his mouth, uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's coat. Odessa breathed out slowly. "I'll convene a call with Fire, Public Works, and Sheriff's Office. No promises." "No promises," Graham agreed. "And Mr. Mercer?" "Yes." "If this happens, it happens by procedure." He looked back at Jasper, who was no longer folding blankets to leave. The old man sat quietly, one hand resting near Atlas's head. "Then send me the procedure," Graham said. After the call ended, Graham lowered the phone. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening to the cabin breathe. Stove, dog, old man, puppies, wind. Jasper looked up. "Well?" Graham glanced at his messy list, then at Atlas. Nolan says if the roof collapses, he's haunting me. Jasper considered that. Could be worse. How? He might visit while alive. A laugh escaped Graham before he could stop it. It was rough, brief, and unfamiliar in the cabin, but it stayed in the air after it ended. Atlas lifted his head, tail thumping once, as if approving the sound. Outside, the storm continued to write its white law across Brightwater. Inside, Graham folded the unpaid power bill carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Not because it was solved, it was not. Not because he knew how to carry what came next. He did not. But for the first time since Atlas had barked at the station, the burden no longer fit entirely in his two hands. And that, Graham thought, might be the beginning of a different kind of strength. The Brightwater Public Library had not been built for emergencies. It had been built for quiet. On ordinary days, the community room smelled of paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. A bulletin board near the door held notices for quilting circles, winter tire discounts, and a missing orange cat that had been missing so long, half the town suspected he had simply chosen a better family. Along one wall, folding chairs leaned in stacks. Along the other, a mural of the frozen lake showed children skating from another decade, their painted scarves forever lifted by a wind that never changed. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the room no longer felt quiet. Boots dripped melted snow onto the linoleum. Coats steamed faintly in the heated air. A dozen people had come because Graham had called, and a dozen more seemed to have come because a town was a creature that fed on rumors and arrived hungry. Graham stood near the front with a legal pad in one hand and a stiffness in his shoulders he had not managed to put down since Odessa's phone call. Atlas sat beside him, calm as carved stone, his notched ear turned toward every sound. Snow still clung in small crystals along the dog's outer coat. He had refused to stay at the cabin when Graham brought Jasper to the meeting, and Graham had been too tired to argue with the one creature in his life who usually made better decisions than he did. Jasper sat in the first row, wrapped in Ruth's brown blanket and Graham's old canvas jacket. He looked smaller under the library lights than he had beside the stove, his beard combed with Graham's fingers, his hands folded over the knob of a borrowed cane. But his eyes were clear. Exhausted, yes. Embarrassed, certainly. Clear all the same. Ruth Harlan had taken the seat beside him as if it had been assigned by heaven. She wore a plum-colored sweater under her puffy dark coat, and her silver curls kept escaping the scarf tied around her head. A cloth tote full of folded towels rested at her feet. Every few minutes she glanced at Jasper, pretending she was not checking whether he was warm enough. Nolan Creed stood at the back, arms crossed over a red and black flannel shirt, pencil behind his ear like a small wooden threat. He had not sat down, perhaps because sitting would suggest he had agreed to be involved. Marion Vale occupied a chair near the aisle with a veterinary file balanced on one knee. Her hair had come loose from its low tie, and there was a thin scratch along her wrist that had not been there that morning. She looked like a woman who had fought a goat, 3 phones, and her own feelings, and lost patience with all of them. Eli Boone leaned against the wall near the door, yellow waterproof notebook in hand. He had the settled stillness of a man who preferred exits to speeches. Beside him stood Harriet Moss, whom Graham knew mostly by reputation and by the fact that every building in Brightwater seemed to straighten up when she entered it. Harriet was short, solid, and unsentimental. Her silver hair was cut close to her head, and her volunteer fire department jacket hung from her shoulders with the authority of a judge's robe. A heavy metal flashlight was clipped to her belt. She had not said much after arriving. She had simply looked Graham up and down and said, "If you're wasting my afternoon, I'll know in 10 minutes." At the front table, Odessa Pike arranged her folder, pen, and phone in a neat line. She wore a gray wool coat, buttoned to the throat, boots clean despite the weather, hair pinned into a low twist that seemed immune to storms. Her blue-gray eyes moved over the room, measuring not just people, but consequences. Graham noticed the folder in front of her. Dark blue, stiff-backed, tabbed with labels. Temporary warming use. Animal intake. Liability. Fire review. It looked less like a folder than a gate. Odessa tapped her pen once. "Let's begin." The room settled reluctantly. "This is not a town council meeting," she said. "This is an emergency discussion regarding Mr. Mercer's proposal to open a limited portion of the old Brightwater station as a temporary warming location during the current storm event. Nothing decided here becomes permanent authorization. Everyone understands that?" Nolan muttered. "Sounds like a council meeting wearing a fake mustache." Ruth shushed him. Graham stepped forward before his nerve could sour into irritation. "The cabin can't hold this," he said. It was not the opening he had planned. He had written 3 better sentences on the legal pad. One had the word community in it. One had responsibility. The third sounded like something carved onto a courthouse. But when he looked at Jasper in the first row and Atlas beside him, the plain truth was the only one that would stand. "I brought Jasper and the 3 pups in because there wasn't time for anything else. That was right for last night. It's not enough for tonight. The storm's getting worse. There are adults in town sleeping in vehicles and under loading docks. Some won't go to the county shelter because they can't bring their animals." A woman near the back folded her arms. "Animals carry fleas." Marion looked up. "So do people, if neglected long enough. Both are treatable." A nervous laugh moved through the room and died quickly. Graham continued. "I'm not asking to open the whole station, only the main waiting room and the old ticket office. 3 nights, emergency use, adults only, no minors, no alcohol, animals on leashes or in carriers. Marion handles health checks. Eli handles intake and calls if there's trouble. Harriet inspects fire and safety before anyone sleeps there." Harriet lifted one hand. "Inspects before anyone enters for anything longer than a walkthrough." Graham nodded. "Before anyone enters for anything longer than a walkthrough." Odessa made a note. "And who coordinates supplies?" she asked. "I will." "Who cleans?" Graham hesitated. Ruth raised her hand halfway. "Laundry I can handle. Floors need a crew." Nolan made a sound of despair. "Here it comes." "Thank you, Nolan," Ruth said sweetly. "I did not volunteer." "You stood in the back with a pencil. That is practically a vow." The room laughed more easily this time. Even Jasper's mouth twitched. Odessa did not smile. Humor aside, these questions matter. Who is responsible if a dog bites another animal? If someone trips on damaged flooring? If a space heater overloads a circuit? If an animal with illness exposes others? If someone arrives intoxicated? If someone refuses to leave after the emergency period? Each question landed like a board dropped on the floor. Graham had answers for some, not all. The old reflex rose in him, hard and immediate. Push back, take responsibility, tell them he would handle it. The words gathered behind his teeth. Atlas shifted, not dramatically. He merely leaned his shoulder against Graham's leg, enough pressure to interrupt the old machinery inside him. Graham stopped. He looked down at the legal pad, at the messy names, arrows, and half-formed plans. Then he looked at Odessa. "I don't know all of that yet," he said. The room quieted, surprised by honesty where a speech had been expected. Graham swallowed. "That's why you're here." Odessa's pen stilled. For the first time that afternoon, the meeting seemed to become less about permission and more about whether anyone was willing to touch the problem without gloves. Marion stood, file in hand. "I can set animal rules. Quick visual health screening on entry. Sick animals separated. Dogs leashed. Cats and small animals in carriers or in a designated corner. Food bowls separated. Waste bags and disinfectant at the door. No animal enters without the person agreeing to basic handling rules." "Who pays for supplies?" Odessa asked. I have some at the clinic, not enough for a month. Enough for 3 nights if people stop pretending expired towels are heirlooms. Ruth nodded. I've got towels. Clean ones? Nolan asked. Ruth gave him a look. I own a laundromat, Nolan. Just checking. Eli spoke from near the door. I can keep a log. Names if people are willing. Descriptions if they're not. Time in, time out, animal type. I'll stop by during patrol rotation. Anyone violent or drunk gets moved out. Moved where? Odessa asked. Depends how drunk and how violent. That was not comforting, but it was honest. Harriet finally stepped away from the wall. None of this matters if the building kills somebody. The room gave her full attention. She took the flashlight from her belt and held it like a gavel. Old station has bad history. West corridor roof is soft. Freight office floor is questionable. Electrical panel hasn't been inspected in years. If I see exposed wiring, water near outlets, blocked exits, or space heaters older than Nolan's jokes, I shut it down. My jokes are timeless, Nolan said. They are a fire hazard. This time, even Odessa's mouth nearly moved. Harriet continued. If, and I mean if, the main waiting room is structurally sound enough, and if we can isolate unsafe sections, and if heat is from approved units on safe circuits or generator outside with proper ventilation, then maybe 3 nights can happen. Graham felt the word maybe move through the room like a match cupped against wind. Maybe was not, yes, but it was not no. Then Jasper stood, not quickly. The act cost him. Ruth reached for his elbow, but he gave her a small nod that asked for trust rather than help. Atlas rose too, staying close without touching him. Graham felt a pressure in his chest, the urge to tell the old man to sit down, to save his strength, to let others speak. He held the urge back. Jasper rested both hands on the borrowed cane and looked not at Graham, but at the room. I slept in that station last week, he said. No one answered. The shame in the sentence belonged less to Jasper than to everyone who heard it. I don't say that for pity. I know what pity tastes like. It's thin soup with too much salt. His voice shook, but his eyes did not lower. I say it because some of you think people stay outside because they won't accept help. Sometimes that's true. Pride is a stubborn old mule. I've ridden it farther than I should have. A few people shifted in their chairs. But sometimes a man has a dog he won't leave, or a woman has a cat she raised after her husband died, or someone has an old bird in a cage because it's the only voice that greets them in the morning. Jasper's fingers tightened on the cane. You tell folks, come inside, but abandon the last creature that trusts you, and then you wonder why they choose snow. Atlas stood beside him, still and watchful, a dark guardian against the library's pale floor. Jasper looked toward the window. Snow struck the glass in fine white bursts. There are people out there who are not refusing life, he said quietly. They are refusing to betray the only life that stayed beside them. The room held still. No one coughed, no chair scraped. Even Nolan stopped chewing the inside of his cheek. It was not a speech crafted to win. That was why it did. Jasper sat down slowly. Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder, not fussing, just grounding him. Graham looked at Odessa. The folder in front of her no longer looked like a gate. Not entirely. More like a bridge, waiting for planks. Odessa cleared her throat. Mr. Bell, thank you. Jasper gave a small nod, already embarrassed by having been seen. Marion closed her file. For the record, Maple is still weak. Graham turned toward her. She's alive, Marion said. But if Jasper had reached those puppies even 10 minutes later, I doubt all 3 would be. The words did not swell. They simply fell. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her mouth. Someone at the back whispered, Lord. Odessa looked down at her papers, then up again. I understand the emotional urgency. Harriet snorted softly. Good. Now understand the practical urgency. That somehow changed the air. The meeting broke into work. Not agreement, not harmony. Work. Names were written, supplies listed, roles argued over and corrected. Marion drafted animal intake rules in block letters on the back of an old library event flyer. Eli created a sign-in plan. Ruth began making a blanket inventory with the seriousness of a quartermaster in a soft sweater. Nolan complained about lumber prices while calculating board lengths from memory. Graham stood in the middle of it, oddly useless for a minute. He had imagined resistance as a wall. Instead, it had become a table too crowded with elbows. Odessa gathered the main points and read them aloud. Temporary use only. Main waiting room and ticket office. Unsafe corridors locked and marked. Fire review required. Animal rules posted. Adult occupants only. No minors. No open flames. No unapproved heaters. Intake log maintained. Supplies donated, not purchased by the town unless further authorized. Duration: 3 nights maximum, pending storm conditions. Sounds romantic, Nolan said. It's not meant to be romantic, Odessa replied. Good, because it isn't. Graham looked at him. You still coming to look at the station? Nolan sighed. Somebody has to stop you from fixing a roof with stubbornness. Harriet pointed her flashlight at Graham. We inspect before you touch anything. Yes, ma'am. Don't ma'am me unless you mean it. I do. She studied him for a second, then nodded once. Fine. Let's go see your disaster. They went to the station as the afternoon tilted toward evening. The storm had paused, not ended. Snow fell softer now, thick and slow, turning the world blue at the edges. The old station waited at the north end of town, half buried and patient, its crooked sign wearing a crown of white. The parking area was mostly drift, but Eli's truck broke a path, followed by Nolan's supply pickup, Harriet's fire department vehicle, Graham's old truck, and Odessa's county SUV. Jasper insisted on coming. Graham did not like it. Marion liked it even less. But when both began to object, Jasper only said, If you're talking about waking up a place I know, I'd prefer to be present at the resurrection. Nolan muttered, Great. Now the building has a pastor. Careful, Jasper said. I do funerals too. Nolan blinked, then laughed despite himself. At the station door, Graham had to shoulder it twice before the swollen wood gave way. A smell of dust, old varnish, cold iron, and long emptiness rolled out. Harriet stepped in first and swept her flashlight across the floor. No one moves past me, she said. No one did. The beam found peeling paint, benches bolted to the wall, a potbelly stove long disconnected and rusted at the base, and old ticket windows clouded with grime. Dust lifted in the light like disturbed memory. A faded schedule still hung crooked behind cracked glass, promising departures that would never come. Jasper stood at the threshold, one hand on the frame. His face changed, not with grief exactly. Something older, recognition mixed with apology. My wife caught the westbound here in '74, he said. Went to Helena to help her sister after surgery. I waited right there when she came back. He nodded toward the bench beneath the window. Had flowers. Dropped half of them when she stepped off the train. Ruth smiled gently. What did she do? Laughed at me for 40 years. The station seemed to listen. Even Harriet lowered her flashlight a fraction. Atlas moved ahead only when Harriet permitted it. He sniffed the floorboards, then the base of the ticket office door. His tail moved once, slow. Then he looked back at Graham. Graham had seen that look in doorways before, in villages, in ruined houses, in places where people had left too fast or stayed too long. Not danger, possibility. Harriet began her inspection. She stomped boards, checked exits, shone her light into corners, and pronounced several areas "absolutely not," which Nolan marked with orange tape from his truck. The west corridor was blocked off immediately. The freight office was condemned with a look, but the main waiting room held better than expected. The ticket office was dusty but dry. One side window needed plywood. The front door needed a brace. The floor near the old stove was weak but avoidable. Nolan measured with a tape, pencil now in his mouth. "We can board this. Brace that. Don't use the stove. Don't even look at the stove with hope. 2 approved heaters on separate circuits if Harriet doesn't murder the panel." "I murder only when necessary," Harriet said from the electrical closet. Odessa stood just inside the doorway, folder pressed to her chest. Her gaze moved across the room, not with warmth, but with calculation beginning to bend toward use. "It would need signage," she said. Ruth looked at her. "I can write signs. Legible signs. I was married to a man with terrible handwriting for 36 years. I know the value of legibility." Eli opened the old ticket office and coughed as dust rose. "This could be intake." Jasper stepped closer. "It used to be." They all looked at him. "Tickets," he said. "Lost bags. Telegrams. Questions from travelers who didn't know where they were going." His hand rested on the counter. "Seems fitting." Graham watched the old man's fingers move across the worn wood. The station had been Jasper's shelter because it was abandoned. Now it might become shelter because people chose not to abandon it. That difference felt enormous. Harriet returned from the electrical closet. "Panel's ugly, but not dead. I want a proper electrician before any long-term use. For 3 nights, with 2 approved heaters, no extension cord nonsense, and someone checking hourly, maybe." There was that word again. Maybe. Odessa looked at Harriet. "You'll certify that?" "I'll write what I actually saw. Don't pretty it up." "I don't pretty things up." "Good. We'll get along terribly." Nolan slapped his tape measure shut. "I've got plywood, screws, 2 heater units still in boxes, and enough bad attitude to last until midnight." Ruth lifted her tote. "I have towels." Marion, who had been quieter than usual, checked her phone. "Maple's still stable. My assistant's watching her." Graham absorbed the sentence like a prayer. Odessa opened her folder and pulled out a blank form. Her pen hovered. 48 hours, she said. "If this space is made safe enough for emergency use, and Harriet confirms it, I'll authorize 3 nights under storm conditions. No expansion, no permanent promise." Graham nodded. "No grandstanding," Odessa added. He looked around the old station. Jasper at the ticket counter, Ruth with her towels, Nolan already complaining at a window, Eli marking intake flow, Harriet glaring at the ceiling, Marion texting instructions about a puppy fighting for breath, Atlas standing in the center of the waiting room as if he had been born to keep watch there. "No," Graham said, "no grandstanding." Outside, evening pressed blue against the broken windows. Inside, dust drifted through flashlight beams like old snow falling upward. Jasper placed his palm flat on the ticket counter. "Hello, old girl," he whispered. Atlas walked to the center of the room, sniffed once, and lay down. Not at Graham's feet, not by the door. In the middle, as if the station had already become a place someone might trust. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Nolan kept quiet, which in Brightwater nearly qualified as a miracle. Then Harriet clicked her flashlight off and said, "Well, standing around won't make it warmer." The spell broke into motion. Graham picked up a sheet of plywood. Nolan grabbed the other end without being asked. Ruth began wiping the ticket counter. Eli marked the unsafe hallway with tape. Odessa wrote the temporary authorization in precise lines. Jasper stayed at the threshold of the ticket office, one hand on the old wood, watching not a ruin return to glory, but a room returned to purpose. And Atlas remained in the center, breathing steady, a warm, dark shape in a cold, forgotten station. Not a miracle. Not yet. But perhaps the place where one could begin. For 2 days, the old Brightwater station forgot how to be abandoned. Hammers rang where silence had lived for years. Boots crossed the waiting room in wet tracks. Dust rose, was wiped down, rose again, and was wiped down by someone more stubborn than dust. The old building complained at every nail and plank, but no one listened to its complaints for long. Brightwater had enough complaining already, and most of it came from Nolan Creed. "Mercer!" Nolan barked from beneath the front window, a pencil clamped between his teeth. "If you hand me one more warped board, I'm reporting you to the lumber authorities." There are lumber authorities? There should be. I'd chair the committee. Graham passed him a better board. Nolan grunted as though gratitude had personally offended him and went back to fastening plywood over the cracked glass. The main waiting room changed slowly, not beautifully, but honestly. No one pretended they were restoring the place. They were not polishing history. They were making one room strong enough to hold a night. Harriet Moss marked unsafe areas with orange tape and signs written in thick black marker. West corridor closed. Freight office closed. Do not use old stove. The last sign she taped directly over the rusted potbelly stove, then looked around the room as if daring anyone to romanticize it. "No open flames," she said for the 6th time. Nolan raised a hand. "What about Graham's personality?" Also discouraged. Ruth Harlan laughed from the ticket counter, where she had turned the old ledge into a supply table. Clean towels were stacked by size. Blankets were bundled with white ribbon. A row of mismatched mugs sat beside a kettle that Harriet had inspected, disassembled with her eyes, and finally permitted to exist. Ruth worked with the cheerful seriousness of a woman who understood that dignity often arrived folded. She did not toss blankets into piles. She tied them. She labeled them. She made each bundle look less like charity and more like something prepared for a guest. Marion Vale claimed the far corner nearest the interior wall, away from drafts, and made it the animal station. She taped up rules in blunt handwriting. Dogs leashed, cats in carriers or designated crates. Sick or weak animals checked first, no shared food bowls. Ask before touching any animal. At the bottom, after a long pause, she added, "This means you, Nolan." "I am being persecuted by women with markers," Nolan said. "Then stop trying to pet everything with a pulse," Marion replied without looking up. Eli Boone set up the intake table inside the old ticket office. The room still smelled of dust and dry wood, but Jasper had spent most of the morning wiping the counter and sorting pencils, forms, donated gloves, and paper cups. He was not in charge. No one had made that mistake. He was simply there, wrapped in a clean gray cardigan Ruth had found, his fingerless gloves moving carefully through small tasks. That distinction mattered. Being useful without being used was a rare mercy. Every so often, Jasper paused and looked through the ticket window into the waiting room. Once Graham caught him resting his palm flat against the worn wood, his face turned slightly away. The old man's eyes were wet, but he was smiling. "Used to be," Jasper said quietly when Graham stepped near. Folks came to this window asking how far they could go. Graham looked around at the taped-off hallway, the plywood, the buckets catching old leaks. "Not far tonight." "No," Jasper said. "But maybe far enough?" That sentence stayed with Graham longer than he wanted it to. He worked harder after that. Too hard. By the second afternoon, everyone had begun to notice. Graham carried plywood before Nolan asked for it. He rechecked Harriet's taped lines after she had already checked them twice. He moved Ruth's blanket bundles because he thought the stacks were too close to the heater, then moved them back when Ruth quietly explained she had placed them there because the floor stayed dry. He tried to take Eli's intake forms and rewrite them in clearer columns. Eli held the clipboard away from him. "No," I can make it faster. You can make it yours. That's not the same thing. Graham's jaw tightened. Eli did not flinch. He had the calm cruelty of a man offering the truth without raising his voice. Across the room, Atlas lifted his head from where he lay beside the puppy crate. Biscuit and Lantern had been brought from Marion's clinic for the afternoon, so they could be monitored near the warming station while the roads worsened. Maple remained at the clinic under the care of Marion's assistant, connected to warmth, formula, and the sort of stubborn hope that did not make announcements. Biscuit had already tried to chew one of Nolan's bootlaces. Lantern had crawled against Atlas's side and fallen asleep as if the German Shepherd were a mountain built for small faith. Graham saw Atlas watching him. "What?" he muttered. Atlas blinked slowly. It was worse than judgment. It was patience. By evening, Harriet signed the temporary fire review in her blocky handwriting. "Main waiting room and ticket office only," she said, handing the paper to Odessa, who had arrived with her blue folder and a face arranged into official caution. "2 approved heaters. No extension cords crossing walkways. Generator remains outside, vented away from entrances. Hourly checks. Exit kept clear. If the west wall starts sounding like a dying whale, everyone leaves." Odessa read the paper twice. Dying whale is not standard language. "It will be if I write enough reports." Odessa looked as if she wanted to object, then chose survival. The storm hit full force just after dark. It came not as snowfall, but as siege. Wind slammed against the boarded windows. Snow hissed through the cracks in the old door before Nolan added a brace and cursed at the hinges like they owed him money. The station lights flickered once, then steadied under the approved generator humming outside in its sheltered position. The room glowed with a hard, practical brightness that left no corner fully romantic. "Good," Harriet said. "Romance caused fires." The first person arrived at 7:15. His name was Amos Reed, though he did not offer it until Eli asked twice. He was a former miner by the look of his hands, and the cold, dark scars worked into his knuckles. He wore a faded denim coat under a blanket and carried an elderly gray cat zipped inside the front of his sweatshirt. Only the cat's flat face showed, furious at the entire state of Montana. "Cat's name?" Eli asked. Amos frowned. "Deputy?" Eli looked up. "You named your cat Deputy?" "No, I'm calling you Deputy. Her name's Duchess." From inside the sweatshirt, Duchess gave a gravelly meow that suggested she had once ruled kingdoms and found this one lacking. Marion examined her quickly, declared her old, irritated, and probably wiser than most elected bodies, then directed Amos to the cat corner. The second arrival was Tessa Moreland, a woman in her late 50s with a weather-browned face and a blue knit hat pulled low over short black hair. She had been living in her van since autumn, after a motel job ended and the manager changed the locks on staff rooms. She brought a small terrier mix named Pickle, whose legs were stiff with arthritis and whose expression suggested he had seen empires rise and fall and disapproved of both. Tessa apologized 3 times for taking space. Ruth gave her a blanket bundle and said, "Around here, space is like soup. It's better when shared." Tessa blinked at that, unsure whether to laugh. Pickle sneezed on Ruth's boot. "Bless you," Ruth told him solemnly. More came after that. A man who slept behind the tire shop and carried 2 pigeons in a ventilated crate. A quiet woman with a scar across her cheek, and a mutt who leaned against her leg whenever anyone walked too close. A couple who had been living out of a camper with a rabbit named Mr. Lincoln. No one asked for their life stories. That was part of the rule no one had written down. They gave names if they wanted. They accepted soup if they could. They kept their animals close. Some sat against the wall and closed their eyes immediately, as if warmth had become a language their bodies still remembered, but did not trust. Graham moved among them like a man on patrol. Too fast, too tense. He adjusted the heater angle after Harriet had set it. He told a man to move his bag away from the exit before Eli could. He picked up towels Marion had placed deliberately beside the animal station and carried them to Ruth, who carried them back without a word. Finally, Marion caught him by the sleeve near the ticket office. "Stop orbiting. I'm helping. You're making everyone feel inspected." Graham looked across the room. Tessa lowered her eyes when he glanced her way. Amos pulled Duchess closer inside his sweatshirt. Jasper pretended to organize pencils he had already organized 3 times. Graham's stomach sank. "I don't mean to." "I know." Marion's voice lost its bite for one breath. "That's why I'm telling you before someone believes you do." He stepped back into the ticket office, where Jasper sat behind the counter with a stack of intake cards. The old man did not look up immediately. "You all right?" Graham asked. Jasper smiled faintly. "People ask that when they are not." Graham leaned one shoulder against the wall. The station groaned under a gust of wind. Dust trembled down from a seam in the ceiling. "I keep thinking if I don't watch every corner, something will fail," Graham said. Jasper slid a pencil into a chipped mug. "Something will." Graham looked at him. The old man shrugged. "Not everything, but something. A towel will be misplaced. A dog will bark. Nolan will say a foolish thing, possibly on purpose. Someone will spill soup. The building will complain. That is not failure. That is a room full of living creatures." Beyond the ticket window, Atlas lay on the floor with a lantern tucked under his chin and Biscuit trying to climb over his foreleg. The big dog did not move, except to shift his paw so the puppy would not fall. Jasper followed Graham's gaze. "That dog understands," he said. "He does not hold them still. He only gives them somewhere safe to be foolish." Graham had no answer. Then Odessa came in. The front door opened against the storm, and she stepped through with snow clinging to her gray parka, blue folder tucked beneath one arm. Her hair, usually perfect, had loosened at the temple. That small disorder made her look more human, and somehow more severe. Her eyes counted the room. 1, 2, 5, 9, 12. Too many. Graham saw it before she spoke. "You said 8, Odessa said. "I said we were prepared for 8. There are 14 people in this room." 13, Eli said from the intake table. "Harriet doesn't count as people when angry." Harriet, checking the generator log near the door, said, "Correct." Odessa did not laugh. "This exceeds the temporary approval." "Storm exceeds the forecast," Graham said. Her gaze sharpened. "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Make me the villain because I can count." The room quieted around them. Graham lowered his voice. "I'm not asking you to ignore risk. You're asking me to stand inside it and call it compassion. I'm asking you to look outside. I have looked outside. That is why I am concerned." Odessa's gloved hand tightened on the folder. "A shelter cannot become a disaster with a roof." Graham's patience cracked. "Outside is a disaster without one." The words hit hard enough that even Nolan stopped moving. For a moment the storm seemed to lean against the building and listen. Then the west side of the station screamed. Not a human sound, a building sound, metal wrenching, wood splitting, wind finding a weakness, and prying with both hands. Harriet's head snapped up. "Everyone away from the west tape!" The lights flickered. A plywood patch near the rear service passage tore loose with a crack like a gunshot. Snow burst inward through a gap no one had thought large enough to matter. Cold air knifed across the floor. The animals reacted first. Duchess yowled, Pickle barked, the rabbit's crate rattled, and Biscuit let out a sharp, panicked cry. At the same time, Marion's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and the color left her face. "The clinic lost power," she said. "They're bringing Maple." Graham turned. "What?" "My assistant's 10 minutes out. Backup heat failed in the small animal room. Maple can't ride this out there." The front door opened again before anyone could absorb it. A young veterinary assistant stumbled in, carrying a covered carrier against her chest, snow plastered to her coat. She was an adult in her 20s, cheeks raw from cold, eyes wide behind fog glasses. "Dr. Vale!" Marion took the carrier immediately. Inside, beneath warmed cloths, Maple made a thin sound that barely qualified as protest. The room tightened. Graham moved toward them, but Atlas was faster. The German shepherd rose from the floor, nudged Lantern gently aside, then crossed to the animal corner. As wind swept snow across the room, Atlas lay down between the loose rear gap and the crate Marion set on the floor. He did not bark. He simply placed his body where the cold was entering, a living wall of fur and calm. "Atlas," Graham said. The dog looked at him once, not for permission, for understanding. Marion knelt behind Atlas, using his bulk as shelter while she checked Maple. Ruth and Tessa dragged blanket bundles toward the animal corner. Amos, still clutching Duchess, used his shoulder to help Nolan force the loose plywood back against the gap. Eli caught Jasper as the old man slipped trying to carry towels across the wet floor. "I told you to stay seated," Eli said. Jasper gasped, then replied, "I have been ignoring good advice since before you were handsome." "I was never handsome?" "Then you have my sympathy." Even in the panic, someone laughed. Odessa stood frozen near the entrance, snow melting on her folder. Not useless, not uncaring. Frozen because the thing she had feared was happening, and yet not in the shape she had feared. There was no stampede, no selfish chaos, no cruelty in the crush of frightened bodies. People moved because others needed space. Amos held plywood while Nolan screwed it down. Tessa calmed Pickle with one hand and passed towels with the other. Ruth wrapped the veterinary assistant in a blanket without asking. Harriet shouted precise instructions, and everyone obeyed, possibly because her voice could have stabilized a bridge. Graham braced the plywood beside Nolan, shoulder burning, breath hard. "Move your hand," Nolan snapped. "You move yours." "I need mine. It's skilled labor." "It's attached to a fool." "Then stop copying it." They pushed together. The board caught. Nolan drove screws into the frame with furious speed. Harriet checked the gap, then the ceiling, then the heater lines. "It holds for now. Not pretty." Nolan panted. "Neither are you." Harriet pointed the drill at him. "Careful." Across the room, Marion looked up from Maple. "Still with us?" she said. A breath moved through the station. Not relief exactly, but permission to keep going. Odessa closed her folder. The sound was small, final. She removed her gray parka and handed it to Ruth. "Use this to block the draft under the ticket office door." Ruth stared. "Odessa, that coat is wool." Then it should finally do something useful. Odessa turned to Harriet. Her voice had changed. It was still controlled, still precise, but the fear had moved from stopping the room to strengthening it. "Tell me what makes this safer right now." Harriet studied her for half a second, then nodded toward the rear passage. "I need that gap sealed better, wet floor dried, one heater shifted 2 feet east, and someone on door duty, so we stop losing half the building every time Compassion walks in." Odessa took off her gloves. "I can do door duty." Graham looked at her. She met his eyes, not yielding, not apologizing. "I still want logs," she said. "You'll get them." "And head counts." "Yes." "And if Harriet says evacuate?" "We evacuate." Odessa nodded once. "Then stop staring and carry something." It was not surrender. That was what made it matter. The next hour became a rough hymn of work. No one sang, but the room found rhythm. Eli managed the intake table, while Jasper sorted dry gloves from wet ones, one careful pair at a time. Ruth ladled soup into paper bowls and handed them out as though serving guests at a winter wedding thrown by exhausted saints. Marion kept Maple warm in a carrier tucked behind Atlas, who remained in place until the draft was fully blocked. Tessa sat beside the animal corner, whispering to Pickle and Lantern alike. Amos allowed Duchess to glare at everyone from his lap. Odessa stood at the door with a clipboard, counting people in and out, warning newcomers about the rules before Graham could say a word. When one man tried to enter with an open bottle tucked in his coat, she did not shame him. She simply said, "You can come in. The bottle cannot." He looked at the storm, looked at her, and set it outside beneath the awning. Graham saw that. He said nothing. Some things deserved to be noticed quietly. By midnight, the station had changed again. Not repaired, not safe forever. Not beautiful, but alive. The generator hummed, the approved heaters glowed, the wet floor had been mopped, the rear gap was sealed with plywood, towels, and Odessa's sacrificed parka pressed into service like a noble flag that had chosen humility. People rested along the walls under Ruth's blankets. Animals slept in pockets of warmth. The air smelled of soup, damp wool, sawdust, and tired breathing. Graham stood near the center of the room, too tired to pretend he was not. Atlas finally rose from the animal corner and came to him, stretching stiffly before pressing his shoulder against Graham's leg. Maple slept behind Marion's bag, small but breathing. Biscuit had collapsed into a towel nest. Lantern, loyal little shadow, had fallen asleep with one paw resting on Atlas's tail. Jasper looked out through the ticket window and gave Graham a small nod. Not thank you, not well done. Something better. You see it now? Graham did. He saw Nolan asleep sitting up with a drill still in his hand. Ruth wrapping one more blanket around a woman who had not asked. Eli writing the hourly count in his waterproof notebook. Harriet checking the heater cord for the third time because vigilance was her form of prayer. Odessa at the door, hair loose now, blue folders set aside, holding the clipboard as if rules were not walls but beams. Graham had carried many heavy things in his life, men, weapons, orders, silence, names that no one said anymore. He had mistaken carrying for strength. But here, beneath a roof held by plywood, stubbornness, donated towels, and more hands than he could count, another kind of strength stood quietly around him. A burden shared did not become light. Not exactly. It became possible. Outside, the storm kept clawing at the old station. Inside, no one stood alone enough for it to win. After the storm, Brightwater began talking about the station as if it had become a person. Some spoke of it kindly. At the bakery, people said the old place had finally done something useful again. At the laundromat, Ruth heard women discussing how many blankets might be needed if the weather turned worse before spring. A retired schoolteacher dropped off 3 boxes of paper cups and wrote, "For the station," on the side, in careful blue marker. Someone left 2 bags of dog food outside Marion Vale's clinic before sunrise, with no note except a drawing of a paw. But not every voice warmed with the weather. At the grocery store, a man near the produce bins asked whether Brightwater was now inviting every drifter in Montana to bring their animals downtown. A woman called the town office to complain about stray dogs near public property, though the only dog she had seen was Pickle, who moved with the speed and threat level of a damp sock. 2 written complaints arrived in Odessa Pike's inbox before noon. By evening, there were 5. The temporary authorization had ended with the emergency storm window. That was the sentence Odessa repeated when she came to the station 2 days later, blue folder tucked beneath one arm, her hair once again pinned into order. "The 3-night permit is done," she said. No one cheered. The main waiting room still smelled of damp wood and soup. The plywood patch on the rear wall held, but it looked ugly in the honest way emergency repairs often did. Blankets were folded along one bench. The animal corner had been cleaned twice under Marion's supervision, and a handwritten sign reminded everyone that shared food bowls were not community spirit, they were disease transmission. Graham stood near the ticket office counter, arms crossed, his olive drab combat shirt sleeves pushed up past his forearms. There was sawdust on one shoulder and a shallow cut across his knuckle he did not remember getting. Atlas lay by the puppy crate, where Biscuit was trying to chew the corner of a towel, while Lantern watched him with solemn admiration. Maple slept in a small, warmed carrier near Marion's bag. She was still too thin, still not safe enough for celebration. But when Jasper tapped one finger lightly on the counter, Maple lifted her head. That small movement had made Ruth cry into a stack of clean dishcloths that morning, though she denied it fiercely. Odessa looked around the room. If this continues, it needs a structure. Nolan Creed, balancing on a ladder beneath the front window, groaned. Everything needs a structure. That's why I'm up here fixing one. I mean procedure, Odessa said. Worse. Marion snapped the latch on her medical case. For once, she's right. Nolan looked down. I hate when that happens. Marion ignored him. The puppies need official foster paperwork. Right now, they're abandoned animals under emergency veterinary hold. Once road's clear, the county shelter can require transfer unless we establish a local temporary foster arrangement. Graham turned sharply. Transfer where? County facility, most likely, maybe farther if they're full. Jasper's hand stilled on the ticket counter. Lantern, as if sensing a change in the room, crawled closer to Atlas and tucked himself under the German shepherd's chin. Atlas did not move. He simply lowered his head until the puppy disappeared into the dark fur of his chest. Graham looked at Maple. No? Marion's eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. No is not paperwork. The words landed harder than Graham liked. Eli Boone entered before he could answer, stamping snow from his boots outside first because Ruth had threatened to label him a floor criminal if he tracked slush across her clean station. He carried his yellow waterproof notebook, but this time there was a folded printout tucked inside. Got something on the dumping, he said. The room shifted toward him. Eli opened the paper on the counter. The image was grainy, taken from the gas station camera near the service road. A dark vehicle crossed the frame, half blurred by snow and old glass. The license plate was partly obscured by mud, but 2 numbers and a county marking were visible. Not enough for a clean citation by itself, Eli said, but enough to connect it to a man out of Kalispell who's been paid cash to move unwanted litters between towns. Not a licensed transport. Animal control has had his name before. Ruth's face hardened in a way that made her look less like a laundromat owner and more like a saint preparing to throw furniture. You mean he does this often? Allegedly, Eli said. And I use that word because I enjoy staying employed. Graham stared at the photograph. There it was. Not justice, not yet. Just proof that cruelty had used tires and a heater and a windshield. A human had driven away from 3 small lives in the snow and gone somewhere warm. His hands curled. Atlas lifted his head. Eli noticed. Mercer? I'm fine. No, you're still. Graham looked up. Eli folded the printout. Still is not always fine. The old anger had returned, useful at first, then dangerous. Graham could feel it lining up inside him, giving him a target because targets were easier than helplessness. He wanted the man in the vehicle, wanted his name, wanted an address, wanted the world to make sense in the old way where a wrong thing could be met and stopped with force. But Biscuit sneezed, a ridiculous tiny sneeze. Everyone looked down. Biscuit blinked, offended by his own face. The room breathed again. Eli slid the paper back into his notebook. I'll file it with County Animal Control and the Sheriff's Office. If they can match the vehicle, they'll proceed. This part is not yours to carry. Graham almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, because everyone had decided, apparently, to spend the week telling him what was not his to carry. The problem was, his hands did not know what else to do when empty. By afternoon, the station was full of small tasks that should have comforted him. They did not. Ruth sorted blankets into 2 stacks, people and animals. Graham moved the animal stack closer to the door because he thought it made more sense there. Ruth moved it back without comment. Nolan replaced a cracked board near the ticket office. Graham told him the plank sat a 1/4 inch high. Nolan held the hammer still and looked at him. "You want to fix it?" "Yes." "Then pay me and leave." Graham's mouth shut. Near the intake table, Eli updated the log system. Graham suggested adding weather notes, arrival condition, animal type, supply issued, exit time, and follow-up status. Eli stared at him over the page. "This is a warming station, not an invasion dossier. Details matter. So does not frightening people with a clipboard." Graham walked away. He found Jasper lifting a soup crate near the old ticket counter. The crate was not enormous, but it was too heavy for him. The old man's shoulders tightened as he tried to raise it. One end dragged. A few cans shifted and clattered. "Put that down," Graham said. Jasper looked up. "I have it." "No, you don't. I said I have it. And I said put it down." The room went quiet in a way Graham hated before he understood why. His voice had sharpened, not loud, not cruel, but hard enough to turn concern into command. Jasper's hands loosened on the crate. His face changed, not into anger, but into that careful blankness of a man trying to disappear while still standing in front of everyone. Atlas rose. He did not bark. He did not growl. The German shepherd stepped between Graham and Jasper, his body calm, his amber eyes fixed on Graham's face. Biscuit tumbled against one of his back paws and sat down, confused by the sudden stillness. Lantern froze beside the crate. Maple lifted her head from the carrier, too weak to understand the room but sensitive to its hush. Graham looked at Atlas. The dog's gaze did not accuse him. That was worse. It asked him to look at himself. Graham lowered his eyes to Jasper's hands, thin, veined, stubborn, trembling slightly from effort and embarrassment. These were not hands refusing help. They were hands trying to earn a place in the room. "I'm sorry," Graham said. The words came rough. Jasper blinked. Graham bent, took one side of the crate, and stopped. "Would you carry this with me?" For a moment, the old man did not move. Then he placed his hands on the other side. Together, they carried it 3 feet to the supply shelf. It was not efficient. Graham could have done it alone in half the time. That was the point. When they set it down, Jasper wiped his fingers on his cardigan and gave Graham a sideways look. "You rescue like a man fleeing a burning house," he said. Graham said nothing. Jasper's voice gentled. "Sometimes people do not need you to drag them out of the storm, son. Sometimes they need you to sit beside them after the storm and admit the roof is still leaking." A soft laugh came from Nolan. "That roof is absolutely still leaking." Ruth shushed him, but not very hard. Graham tried to smile and failed. Jasper touched the edge of the ticket counter. "You think if you stop standing guard, something terrible will get through." "Usually something does." "Maybe," Jasper said, "but if you stand in every doorway, no one else can enter." That stayed in the room longer than the words themselves. Graham walked outside afterward, not far, just beneath the station awning where the cold could hit his face cleanly. Snow had stopped falling for the moment. The sky was a pale iron color, and the street beyond the station was rutted with frozen tracks. Atlas followed and sat beside him. For a while, neither moved. Graham reached into his chest pocket and found the old challenge coin there. His thumb traced its worn edge. He had carried it through years when the world had demanded certainty from him. Left or right, hold or move, fire or wait. Decisions that carved a man into something useful and then forgot to teach him how to become gentle again. "I don't know how to stop," he said. Atlas leaned his shoulder against his leg. That was all. No answer, no command, just wait. Warm, living wait. When Graham went back inside, the station had continued without him. That should have annoyed him. Instead, it humbled him. Ruth had set the blanket stacks correctly. Nolan had fixed the board and written "Mercer approved." Beside it, in pencil, Eli had simplified the intake log without losing the essential details. Marion had drafted a foster care checklist, her handwriting blunt and mercifully legible. Odessa, seated at the supply table, was reviewing the proposal with her pen uncapped. Graham stopped near the door. Odessa looked up. "We need a formal winter pilot." He waited. "Not a permanent shelter," she said quickly, as if the phrase might start a fire. "A limited emergency warming and animal hold network through the end of winter, triggered by severe weather advisories, documented intake, fire checks, veterinary oversight, volunteer rotation, donated supplies. Adults only." Graham looked at Marion. She shrugged. "I told you paperwork could be useful. I never said it would be charming." Nolan raised his hand. "Can we name the paperwork something heroic, like Operation Don't Freeze?" "No," Odessa said. "Operation Warm Paws?" "No." "Operation Odessa secretly has a heart?" "Absolutely not." Ruth tried and failed to hide a smile. Harriet arrived shortly after, carrying a clipboard and a thermos, and read the draft with the expression of a woman inspecting a bridge she might have to cross. She made 3 corrections, crossed out a vague phrase, and added mandatory heater checks every 2 hours. "Hourly," Odessa said. 2 hours, Harriet replied, "unless you want volunteers so tired they plug something stupid into something stupider." "Fine." Eli added a section for coordination with Sheriff Dispatch and Animal Control. Marion added a foster sign-up page. Ruth signed for laundry and blanket management. Nolan signed for structural repairs under protest and wrote "Not free forever" beside his name. Graham stared at the growing list. There was his name too, but it was no longer the only one. Something in him loosened painfully. Marion brought the puppies out one by one for feeding. Biscuit attacked the bottle as if personally insulted by hunger. Lantern drank, then immediately tried to crawl toward Atlas. Maple took only a little, but more than yesterday. When she finished, Jasper tapped 2 fingers against the counter and made a soft clicking sound. Maple lifted her head. Everyone noticed. Jasper looked embarrassed. "Old rescue trick, not magic?" "Good," Marion said. "Magic doesn't chart well." Later, someone arrived with a violin. It came in a cracked black case tied with twine, left by a woman from the church thrift room who remembered hearing that Jasper had once repaired instruments. The violin was old, scratched, and missing the proper shine of cherished things. One string had been replaced badly. The bow needed rehairing. But Jasper opened the case as if someone had placed a sleeping bird in front of him. His hands shook when he touched it, not from cold, from recognition. "I'm not sure I can play anymore," he said. "Then just hold it," Ruth said. He did for a long while. The afternoon faded. The station settled into a quieter rhythm. People came and went. Complaints would still come. Reports would still need filing. The pilot program might fail in a dozen ordinary ways. But for that hour, the old room breathed easier. Near dusk, Jasper tucked the violin beneath his chin. The first note was terrible. Nolan flinched. Something died. "Your manners," Ruth said. Jasper laughed under his breath and tried again. The second note was still rough, but it held. Then came a third, a fourth. not a song anyone could name at first, more like a memory clearing its throat. Atlas raised his head. Lantern did too. Even Maple in her warmed carrier shifted toward the sound. Graham sat down on the end of a bench. It was the first time he had truly sat in days. His body protested immediately, as if every muscle had been waiting for permission to complain. Atlas came over and rested his head on Graham's knee, heavy and warm. Graham placed one hand between the dog's ears, feeling the old notch, the steady breath, the quiet patience that had followed him through war, cabin, storm, and now this strange little resurrection of a train station. Across the room, Odessa spoke quietly with Harriet over the fire checklist. Eli sharpened a pencil for Jasper without making a ceremony of it. Ruth tied another white ribbon around a blanket. Nolan pretended not to watch Biscuit chew his bootlace. Jasper's violin scratched, wavered, and found a fragile line of melody. It was not beautiful in the polished sense. It was better. It was a sound made by something damaged that had not surrendered its purpose. Graham looked around the waiting room and finally understood what the week had been trying to teach him. Letting others help did not mean abandoning the gate. It meant building more doors. Outside, Brightwater's snow lay blue and deep under the coming evening. Inside, the old station held its small warmth, not because one man stood guard over it, but because many hands had chosen not to let it go cold again. Graham closed his eyes for one breath. Just one. And this time, nothing fell apart. Weeks later, winter still owned Brightwater. It sat on the roofs in heavy white folds, slept along the shoulders of the roads, and glazed the lake with a silver stillness so wide it seemed to hold the sky in place. But the season had lost some of its cruelty. The wind no longer came at every door like an enemy. At dawn, sunlight touched the frozen water and broke into 1,000 pale sparks. Icicles along the hardware store awning dripped one clear note at a time, like the town was learning music again. The old station did not become a miracle. It became work. The west corner still leaked when the afternoon thaw warmed the roof. The plywood over the rear patch bowed slightly unless Nolan checked the screws every few days. One heater made a clicking sound that drove Harriet Moss nearly to violence, though she insisted violence would be performed only after proper inspection. The donation jar near the ticket window rarely held enough. Odessa Pike still required weekly reports, fire logs, animal intake sheets, cleaning records, and a list of volunteer hours written in ink, not optimism. And some people still complained. A man from the far side of town wrote to the council that the station would lower property values, although the property in question was an empty lot containing one snow-buried boat trailer and a tire no one claimed. A woman refused to donate blankets because she had heard those people might not return them folded. Odessa filed each complaint, answered what required answering, and quietly ignored the rest. The door stayed open during severe weather hours. That was the victory. Not loud, not polished, not framed in ribbon. Just a door that opened. The main waiting room had earned a name before anyone officially approved one. Ruth started it, because Ruth named things the way other people breathed. Atlas's room could use another mop, she had said one morning, standing with a bucket in one hand and her plum sweater sleeves rolled to the elbow. Nolan looked up from a hinge repair. Atlas doesn't pay rent. Neither do you when you stand around criticizing. I'm providing atmosphere. You're providing sawdust. Jasper, who had been behind the ticket counter sorting donated gloves, repeated the word softly. Atlas's room. By the next week, people were saying it without thinking. The Atlas room. Not shelter, not warming site, not temporary emergency station annex, which was what Odessa called it when using forms. The Atlas room sounded less like paperwork and more like a place where a creature with a notched ear had decided the world might still be worth guarding. Jasper carved the sign himself. The wood came from a scrap Nolan claimed was useless, which of course meant he sanded it twice before handing it over. Jasper worked slowly at the ticket counter, a small knife in his thin hand, lantern asleep on his boot. The letters came out uneven. The A leaned too far left. The S curved like it had changed its mind halfway through. The whole sign had the crooked dignity of something made by an old man who had stopped asking his hands to be young. When Nolan saw it, he squinted. "Looks like it was carved by a drunk bear." Jasper did not look up. "A bear would have charged you more." Ruth laughed so hard she dropped a towel. Even Graham smiled. The puppies, who had entered the story beneath an old coat in a storm, began moving toward separate futures with the reckless confidence of small things that did not know how close they had come to becoming memory. Biscuit went first. Nolan insisted he was not adopting the tan puppy. He was merely keeping the animal out of circulation until a qualified person of sound judgment could be identified. This would have been more convincing if he had not already bought a blue dog bed, 2 chew toys, and a bag of treats shaped like tiny hammers. Biscuit took to the hardware store as if born to supervise commerce. He slept under the register, attacked loose bootlaces, and barked once at a delivery invoice, which Nolan called excellent financial instinct. Lantern stayed with Jasper. No one announced it. There was no ceremony. One evening, the little dark-backed puppy simply followed Jasper into the ticket office, curled beneath the counter, and refused to leave. Atlas watched from the waiting room, tail moving once. Graham saw the old dog's approval in that small motion. Lantern became the station's unofficial bell. When someone approached the door, he ran in a joyous wobble, his yellow-tipped tail waving like a candle flame. He did not yet know how small he was. That made him brave in a way people trusted. Maple remained with Marion Vale at the clinic. "For medical supervision," Marion said. "For how long?" Ruth asked. Marion adjusted her stethoscope and refused to answer. Maple slept in the pocket of Marion's fleece jacket during paperwork and occasionally peered out like a tiny judge. The entire town pretended not to notice that Marion had begun carrying puppy formula in her personal thermos pouch and speaking in a softer voice whenever Maple blinked. "She's fostered," Marion said whenever anyone smiled. "Of course," Odessa replied one day without looking up from her clipboard. "The way Nolan is temporarily not attached to Biscuit." "I heard that," Nolan called from the doorway. "You were meant to." Eli Boone kept working the case of the abandoned puppies, though it never became the grand public reckoning some people wanted. There was a citation, then a county investigation, then a report connecting the dark vehicle to an illegal animal transport arrangement that had moved unwanted litters between towns for cash. It did not end with sirens in the square or a villain dragged before cheering citizens. It ended with paperwork, fines, animal control referrals, and Eli's yellow notebook growing 3 pages heavier. That suited Graham more than he expected. Cruelty had been recorded, not glorified, not given the honor of becoming the story's center. The better ending was breathing in front of him. Biscuit chewing Nolan's pencil, Lantern asleep on Jasper's boot, Maple tucked safely against Marion's heartbeat. Graham remained poor. That truth did not melt with the snow. He still woke before dawn to shovel steps and repair what winter broke. He still came home with cracked knuckles, sore shoulders, and boots crusted white from road salt. His cabin still had a power bill tucked under the trout magnet. His paycheck still required folding into careful parts. But the envelope had changed. The cold fund was no longer only his. On Fridays, when he stopped by the bakery, there might be 2 sacks waiting instead of 1. At the laundromat, Ruth kept a labeled shelf for station blankets, each tied in white ribbon. Marion had a donation box at the clinic marked Winter Animal Care, though someone had drawn a halo over the paw print and she threatened to find the culprit. Nolan kept a crate of unsellable gloves near the hardware door, despite the fact that many still had tags on them. Odessa created a volunteer schedule so precise it looked capable of surviving a congressional audit. Graham still carried things, but not alone. That was harder to accept than hardship in its way. Hardship was familiar. Shared kindness required a man to trust the hands beside his. One evening, near the end of February, Graham arrived at the station after a long day repairing a collapsed shed roof outside town. The sky had turned lavender over the lake, and snow along the road glowed faintly blue in the falling light. Atlas walked beside him, slower now after the day's work, his breath puffing white. Warmth met them at the station door. Not much. Enough? Inside, the Atlas room was doing what rooms are born to do, holding people without asking them to explain why they needed walls. Amos Reed sat near an approved heater, Duchess the cat, glaring from his lap with queenly contempt. Tessa Moreland filled a dish for Pickle, who had decided the station was acceptable, provided everyone understood he was not impressed. A man Graham did not know dried his socks on a rack Harriet had placed at a safe distance from the heat and labeled with 3 separate warnings. Ruth ladled soup from a slow cooker, her cheeks flushed, her white ribbons tied around blanket bundles on the bench behind her. Nolan was kneeling by the door, tightening a hinge. "You're late," he said without turning. "I wasn't scheduled." "That's no excuse." Graham stepped around him. "How's Biscuit?" "Temporarily destructive?" "Still temporary?" Nolan drove the screw in harder than necessary. "Don't start." From the ticket office came the rough, wavering sound of a violin. Jasper sat behind the counter with lantern curled beneath his chair. The old instrument rested beneath his chin. His bow hand still shook. Some notes wandered, some gave up halfway. But every so often a line of melody found itself and crossed the room like a small bird that remembered the shape of air. No one applauded. No one needed to. They listened by becoming quieter. Atlas walked to the center of the room and lay down. It had become his place. Not by command, not by training, but by some decision the station itself seemed to accept. He settled there with the calm gravity of a guardian in an old winter tale. Not fierce, not proud, simply present. Lantern lifted his head at once, trotted over, and curled against Atlas's front paw. Atlas lowered his muzzle until it touched the puppy's back. Graham stood watching them. For most of his life, protection had meant standing between danger and what mattered. Body in the doorway, eyes on the dark, hands ready. Heart locked down until the work was done. But there was another kind of protection, quieter and more difficult. A door left unlocked during the worst weather. A rule written carefully enough to keep people safe instead of keeping them out. A blanket folded so the person receiving it did not feel reduced by need. A dog lying down in the middle of a room so every frightened creature knew the ground was safe. Jasper's violin faltered, then stopped. The old man looked through the ticket window at Graham. "You know," he said, "people don't always need a hero posted at the door." Graham leaned against the counter. "That's so?" "They need the door to open." Jasper glanced toward Atlas. "They need a light that stays on. Maybe a dog foolish enough to trust everybody before they prove they deserve it." Atlas sneezed, as if offended by the word foolish. Ruth called from the soup table. "He said what he said, General." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Jasper set the violin down gently. "You gave this place a start, Graham, but it belongs to more than your shoulders now." Graham looked around. Odessa stood near the posted rules, straightening a paper that did not need straightening. Her gray coat was buttoned neatly, but her boots were wet, and a smear of dust marked one sleeve. She noticed Graham watching. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. If this is about the weekly reports, they are still required." "I figured." "And the heater log." "Yes." "And the animal intake forms." Graham's mouth curved. wouldn't dream of forgetting. Good. She turned back to the sign, hiding whatever almost became a smile. The next morning, snow fell lightly. Not the hard, punishing snow of the storm weeks before. This snow drifted down soft as flour, dusting the sign Jasper had carved and the steps Graham had shoveled before sunrise. The sky held a pale gold edge in the east. The lake remained frozen, but somewhere beneath its skin, water was waiting. Graham stood outside the station with Atlas at his side. Jasper joined them a moment later, wrapped in his gray cardigan beneath a donated coat, lantern bumping against his boot. He carried a mug of coffee in both hands, not because he needed the warmth alone, but because the habit of holding something helped him stand still. Above them, the wooden sign moved gently in the wind. The Atlas Room. Crooked letters. Honest wood. Nolan hated the angle. Ruth loved it. Odessa wanted it sealed against weather. Harriet wanted to check the chain. Marion said if anyone put glitter on it, she would leave town. Graham thought it was perfect. A figure appeared near the end of the road. A man, older but not elderly, wearing a black knit cap and a coat too thin for the morning. His beard was iced white at the edges, though it was brown beneath. In his arms, tucked inside the coat, something moved. As he came closer, Graham saw the narrow face of a cat peering out, gray and old, one ear folded at the tip. The man stopped several yards from the steps, as if invisible lines still separated him from the door. "Morning," Graham said. The man's eyes moved from Graham to Jasper, then to Atlas. People on the edge of cold learned to study dogs. Dogs often told the truth faster than people. "Is this—" The man cleared his throat. "Is there room?" No dramatic silence followed. No speech, no swelling music, except from inside Jasper's violin being tuned badly by someone who had not realized they were providing a soundtrack. Graham looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at Atlas. Atlas stood, descended the steps, and walked toward the man. He did not rush. He did not crowd. He stopped close enough to be seen, then lowered his head slightly and wagged his tail once. The old cat hissed. Atlas accepted the criticism with noble restraint. The man gave a tired laugh, and in that laugh was the sound of someone almost remembering he was allowed to be human. Graham opened the door. "Come in," he said. "We'll get you both warm." The man stepped forward. Behind Graham, the Atlas Room glowed with morning light, soup steam, clean blankets, posted rules, imperfect repairs, and the low murmur of people who had made it through another night. Winter had not ended. The town had not been saved once and for all. There would be more reports, more complaints, more leaks, more bills, more cold mornings when courage looked less like glory and more like showing up with a mop. But the door opened. And for Brightwater, for Graham Mercer, for an old man with a violin and a German shepherd with a notched ear, that was enough to make the snow outside look less like an ending. Almost, if one was generous with the word, almost like spring. Sometimes kindness begins as one person carrying a small bag through the snow. But if it is allowed to grow, it can become a door, a room, a warm light, and a place where the forgotten are no longer asked to survive alone. Graham, Jasper, Atlas, and the people of Brightwater remind us that we do not have to fix the whole world to answer God's call. Sometimes we only need to notice who is cold, who is tired, who is still waiting outside, and then open the door. May this story remind you that hope often arrives quietly, through ordinary hands and loyal hearts. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us who in your life has been a warm light in a cold season. And if you'd like more stories of courage, compassion, and second chances, please subscribe and stay with us.